All right.
And Josh, just a little reminder, we're scheduled for 2 hours, so we don't have to rush. That's a reminder for Josh and for me and for you all in case there are questions that y'all want to ask as we're going. We'll try to monitor that. Because again, I mean, even yesterday's information from on the commissioner's call, there was just a lot. So again, I want us to maybe slow down a bit and not feel so rushed about covering items.
Yeah, that was a bit of a curveball, and we'll talk about that here a little bit. And I do agree, that is going to require some real deliberative sort of actions if we are going to try and sort of adopt those recommendations that he had yesterday afternoon. So, all right, well, I'll go ahead and get started with sort of our regular COVID-19 update that we do in these meetings. Just kind of update y'all on the lay of the land and the most recent statistics on that. So the U.S. has passed the million mark for total cases. It's up to 1.3 million cases across the country. In Texas specifically, it's just a little bit more than 35,000. I think the last time we talked is around 22,000 cases reported in Texas. And then, of course, we have the counties, some of the major counties in Region 1 broken out there. You can see Cameron County has the most with almost 470 cases. And this just kind of shows the new cases. So the previous numbers there were just total cases. So these are new cases reported each day, and you kind of see along the axis there. So each day up to May 6th, new cases. And when I saw this, sort of the takeaway for me is I don't, in terms of reopening things and getting people back out and, to shopping and whatnot, it just doesn't seem like there's a real downward trend here in terms of the new cases. I understand some state leadership is looking at different numbers and hospital capacity and other things, but the takeaway for me is it doesn't look like this thing is slowing down exactly, and I'm just trying to think about what kind of implications that may have for what sort of operations school districts see, are sort of looking to roll out in the fall. If this thing is if we haven't even seen the peak of it, and with sort of these relaxed shelter in place orders, maybe this graph could continue its upward trend over the next few weeks. So again, that's some more sort of speculation, but just this sort of, when I stumbled across this, it didn't seem particularly heartening. And then and some other bad news. We got some new tax revenue data from the controller's office since the last time we spoke. And so for sales tax, you guys may have seen the headlines on this. For sales taxes, which of course funds the majority of state budget, and certainly the largest share of money used to pay for the foundation school program, year over year change was sales tax collections has dropped a little bit more than 9% year over year. Of course, the controller wasn't forecasting the same amount of sales tax collections in 2020. He was forecasting a growth. So in terms of comparison to the state forecast and what state budget is built on, it's even more than 9% drop for sort of that estimated April collection. And just to remind y'all that the April collection amounts reflect economic activity that occurred in March. And so, of course, that about half of March, right, was under the shelter in place orders. And so that's just something to keep in mind whenever we think about, well, what can we expect when the controller reports May collections, right? So May would reflect economic activity in April. And so that was sort of under the full force of the shelter in place orders. And so we could reasonably expect lower collection numbers, relatively speaking, reported for May collections, and we get those numbers in early June. And so that's kind of, and again, this is sort of just closing out the fiscal 20 state budget year. And then with severance taxes, which is just sort of a fancy word for oil and natural gas production taxes, there's even a more precipitous drop there. You can see it's a year-over-year change of a year-over-year drop rather of more than 45%. And we touched on this a little bit last time, I think, when we talked talking about the oil price had dipped for the first time in history, had dipped into negative territory. They didn't stay there long, but they have stayed low, and so that doesn't directly impact school funding. Well, not in a very significant way, but it does impact the overall budget picture, and particularly the amount of money that the state has in the rainy day fund. And of course, with all that's going on, we would expect the legislature to want to lean heavily on those reserve funds. This is also sort of troubling in that regard, that it may not be as flush as lawmakers had originally projected. And then this kind of this was in the commissioner's presentation yesterday, and I think we had sent it out to y'all a couple weeks back. It's what this shows is, this is a group, the NWEA, the Northwest Education Association, I believe is what it stands for. They operate in Washington, I believe, and what this, and they've done some research looking at, they have an assessment tool, the MAP. I don't know if any of y'all use that, but what this is showing is they sort of has taken the typical summer slide that you see from students, and they kind of broke out here by grade, and they sort of extrapolated that out. So if students decline in the same way that they do over the summer, but starting with the the mid-May shutdown, what does that mean for what these kids look like when they come back? And so you can see, this is math, and it's broken out by grade. You can see the declines are particularly strong amongst kind of the younger you are, right? So in third grade, let's see if I can get my mouse over there. So in third grade, you can see this dotted line here is what they're calling the COVID slide, right? So this is essentially summer slide, right? The summer slide portion extrapolated back out to the school closure time. And so you can see where they kind of end up is almost back, kind of even to where they were in, mid-November-ish. And so that's just kind of, when we're trying to think about, okay, whenever we do open next school year, if it's in person or online, what are the kids going to look like when we get them back? And so this is sort of one group's attempt to sort of put some analysis on that. So as you can see, it's particularly problematic with the lower levels in math in particular. Reading, you don't see as quite of a decline, but again, that same kind of trend where the lower grades do seem, so the solid line again is what would typically happen, and then this dotted line here is the sort of forecasted slide due to COVID. So the difference between these two is what we're concerned about, and you can see the difference is larger according to these researchers for the younger grades. And so if anyone did tune into the commissioner's call, he sort of started with this this research, and sort of that launched into a discussion of the provision in House Bill 3, or I guess really just generally speaking, how we may need to adjust the school calendar in light of this, and maybe hopefully try and stave off some of those academic declines. And sort of the first thing he talked about, he pointed to that provision in House Bill 3 that I know we've talked to folks in Region 1 about, what TA is calling the additional days school year incentive. And if you remember, it's a provision in House Bill 3 that provides half-day formula funding for up to 30 additional instructional days. And if you want to go back and watch that HB 3 and 30 video, that would probably be a good idea. But in that, TEA sort of talks about different models in which you can add additional instructional days, right? So you can just tack it on to the end of the school year. You can totally change your school calendar, right, and do these sort of intercessional periods throughout. And so there's several different options there. But yesterday afternoon, he was really encouraging districts, and I think many districts around the state, and I think I'll talk about this on the next slide here, are starting to consider sort of what additional supports they can provide during the summer, and maybe possible changes to next year's calendar. I know this would be very extremely last minute to try and enact some of those changes, but if districts were going to do that, now would sort of be the time to get going on that. And also they so in that call yesterday, the commissioner also pointed to this guide. And this just sort of walks through the various options that are available to folks. So you have, for districts of innovation, you have, it's relatively easy. You can just obtain board approval with new start date. And if it's including your DOI plan. If it's not, you have to do some other steps, draft an amendment, get that adjustment, notify TEA. So it's a little bit more, the timeline's a little bit longer. And if you're not a DOI, then you get to really kick off the whole DOI approval process. That's an even longer ordeal. However, he did also point to another provision in law that, and some of y'all may be familiar with this. It's the year-round designation. And to do that, they sort of outline the steps here. You have to obtain board approval for designation as a year-round system, then get board approval for the calendar, and then notify your service center PEMS coordinator. And so these are sort of the steps there. And so and there's the commissioner also has a PowerPoint on there that sort of outlines some of this as well. So if you haven't taken a look at that, it's on the TEA's coronavirus website under the instructional continuity section. And then one thing to consider in terms of funding with the additional days school year incentive. So, and again, this is just the provision under House Bill 3. For this first year, there's sort of a discrepancy in the timeline on when you can get this money, right? So here's how this would work. If you did make changes to your calendar next school year, and we're looking to get some additional funds from the state. So you essentially go through, and with this example, we just sort of tack it on to the end of the school year. And so you can see that funding starts, you'd be sort of funded additionally, or you'd be funded regularly during the 2021 school year. And then during the 7th 6-week attendance period, that's when your ADA would start to, that's when TEA would really start being, would pick up on your additional ADA. So what that means is then the additional funding for these additional school year days would not be received until during the final settle up, which would be in April or May of 2022. So essentially, you're sort of, just in terms of cash flow purposes, you're kind of having to put up the money to support this operation in the summer of 21, but you're not getting it's not going to be reflected in your summary of finance until April or May and final settle up. This will be corrected. There won't be as big of a gap in like the second year of implementation, because sort of those ADA will already be on the books, and it'll start flowing. At the beginning of the process, the money will start flowing. But just something to consider in this sort of first year, if your district is interested in making that change. And like I said, there's a number of districts. Just these were kind of culled from press reports and just other things we're hearing. Other districts are sort of having these discussions of making changes to their instructional calendar, and these are just some examples. You can see Fort Bend. They have a sort of preliminary plan just to start early in August and dedicate all of August to catching students up, sort of on the content from the prior year, and then after Labor Day, beginning with sort of the new grade level instruction. And so that's sort of their plan for that. I don't, that's about as much as I know about that specific plan. I'm sure if you guys had questions, you could reach out to some contacts at the district, and they could sort of enlighten you all a bit more about what they're thinking. Houston ISD is another example of a district that they're exploring sort of opening up their usual summer school offerings, and just to, usually those are sort of targeted interventions. They're trying to see what their capacity would be for opening that up to more students. And then Dallas ISD just this week sort of laid out some of their contingency plans for the fall, and they sort of see it as unlikely that things will return totally to normal by then. And so sort of their primary plan, I guess, is that there'll be some sort of blended learning approach, and that'll be where students sort of alternate. One group of students is doing in-person instruction, another is doing online instruction, and then they sort of switch and go back and forth like that. And so that's sort of their plan, and all of these plans are still very much under construction, and districts will be making lots of revisions to them. But I just kind of wanted to share a little bit about what I've heard other districts are, how they're sort of thinking about this.
Josh, just real quick.
Uh-huh.
I happened to be on it was a Discovery Education Zoom or webinar yesterday at noon. And Dallas ISD Superintendent Michael Hinojosa was on, and Dade, a Miami-Dade superintendent was on.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you happen to catch any of that. But even in bringing back the kids, like Dallas has already analyzed, or, if they have to keep the social distancing, the 6 feet, then they can maybe get, instead of 22 to 25 kids in a classroom, even 16 or 17, and if anybody listened to this yesterday and you have other comments, please add them to the chat. But that was kind of interesting. And even going back to communities that have a lot of economically disadvantaged children, that probably means that a lot of your parents are working and they're hourly workers. And so he was even pointing out, the limitations in terms of classrooms. So how do you keep the kids separate? And then the elementary kids probably need to be brought in even more so than the secondary kids,
right?
Because at least secondary kids can take care of themselves, but elementary can't. I mean, for the most part, you should not leave those children alone. So there's just, all these considerations that we've never had to deal with, So anyway, I just wanted to toss that in too, that he had added. It was only an hour long, and it was really, really cool to hear the two of them in from two different states, even perspective. And so
yeah, and they have a plan posted on their website. They're on the Dallas ISD website. I can try and get a link over to y'all if you guys wanted to post it to y'all's materials on your website, and it sort of provides a little bit more details, kind of along the lines of what you were just laying out there in terms of what they're thinking.
That would be great if you could just send it to us. We'll just put it on there for today's meeting.
I'll do
Thank
that.
you.
And then there are two districts in the El Paso area that have adopted the year-round model, Socorro and Clint, and that's sort of the provision that the commissioner outlined in his call yesterday afternoon. and so the way it works in those two districts is it has a sort of a shorter summer break and then longer intersession breaks in the fall and spring. And then during those breaks, at least as it has worked historically, those would be for targeted support for students that are struggling, and then other enrichment activities. In the call yesterday, the commissioner sort of said that those could be, given the current environment, those could, would be a little bit more flexible in terms of what those would be used for, not just for targeted support, but maybe some of those kind of like what maybe what Dallas ISD is considering in terms of, uh, sort of phasing students in and sort of using it that way. But he pointed to this year-round model as one possible statutory um, provision that provides some flexibility and some is relatively quick to implement compared to going through the whole DOI process, if you guys haven't done that already. And I'm gonna just check for questions here real quick. Would the seventh 6 week be counted by itself or average with the first six weeks? I believe the way it works for the additional day school year funding is it would sort of count by itself because, right, it's half day, right? It's funded at half day. And there's a formula. If you go back and watch that HB 3 and 30 video, they sort of walk through the math on that. It's been a couple months since I last looked at that. I didn't watch the video in preparation for this presentation today, but that is on my to-do list. And I do recall that they do sort of walk through exactly, okay, if X amount of kids, attend X amount of days, what does that mean in terms of dollars, additional dollars for our schools? So again, that's on the, if we remember where all those HB 3 and 30 videos are, it's I believe that one was recorded in October, and so I would highly suggest that we all go back and rewatch that just to kind of brush up on sort of how the mechanics work there. So sort of moving on to the teacher incentive allotment. I know that there's quite a bit of interest there in Region 1 on that particular item. I sat in on a presentation earlier this week with TEA, with Cody Brown there in the teacher incentive allotment group at TEA. And, the latest from TEA is that the implementation of this is still moving forward. However, with STAR being canceled, that sort of complicates the whole data validation process from the state's perspective, right? So the whole way this would work is, these local systems would develop these optional designation systems, right? Local districts would develop these and sort of send them over to the state for validation and approval. Part of that validation process, well, really most of it, at least from a data perspective, relied on STAR test scores. And so without that sort of requires TEA and Texas Tech, which was providing the support on that, to sort of explore some alternative ways to validate student performance. I think because this is still being decided, they didn't have a whole lot of details to share with us earlier this week. We do have a call with them, Moat Casey staff and TEA staff and the researchers at Tech. We have a call with them on Monday. And hopefully we can kind of get a little bit more information about what their plans are on that. But they are committed to making this work. And really, I should say that for this year, this would impact those in cohorts A and B. And so if you're in cohort C, I guess you would still need that growth score. So it could still impact cohort C, but if you're later than that, the canceling of STAR this year shouldn't impact your plans that much. And then sort of additionally, and if you guys if anyone out there is cohort A or B, you probably noticed in your application that there is sort of a COVID-19 tab in there where you can, where it talks about providing y'all some sort of provisional approval. This would just last for the first year of it. But if you meet a couple requirements that are listed in the application, and TA's put out some rules on this, you can, for cohorts A and B, they can go ahead and get temporary approval, and funds will flow next school year if they meet those requirements. And then also it'd be worth probably everyone, if you're interested in applying to this, all the cohorts, to go look at the statewide performance standards that were published earlier this week as well. And the link is in this presentation here. I know this audience may not be too particularly interested in that, but if there are folks in your districts that are and they haven't seen that, it may be a good item to share. And so just from a sort of a state budget perspective, and I kind of put this together just because all these questions about the sustainability of the TIA and some of these other new allotments that were in House Bill 3. According to TEA, sort of this first year of implementation, right, next school year, the cost of the state will be about $60 to $80 million. And again, that would just be sort of if the cohorts A and B were all approved and sort of on the books. We got these numbers from TEA a couple months back in terms of how many districts are in each of the other cohorts. And you can see it jumps up significantly to C and D once you start looking at those later cohorts. And so what that means from a state budget perspective is it'll be interesting to see what TEA puts in their legislative appropriations request, which they should, I think, is due in August, and kind of see what they put in there for this, because if they're still estimating all of those districts, and these are all districts that turned in those letters of intent. So of course that's not a binding thing, right? You can still, and districts have plenty of other things on their plate, so it's probably likely that some of y'all may delay implementation of this. But I believe once you get into, once you move to cohort C and D, that the annual cost of state starts getting closer into the $600 million range. And so that's just something to sort of keep in mind that, as budget writers, start doing their work later this summer and in the fall, gearing up for session, we'll just have to see what TEA's estimates are in that area. And again, every time TEA has talked about this publicly, they have said we are committed to this program, and we are going to, that they understand sort of the importance of supporting teachers, and so they want to, they're going to sort of fight for this program as much as possible. But I just sort of bring these items up just to kind of give you all a realistic picture of what this could cost the state, and given the funding situation, kind of what that may mean for legislators when they come back next session. And so just some other updates on some other funding allotments or items for the college and career exam reimbursement. You guys may have seen this, that TA has announced that they're expanding the college prep assessment reimbursement window. So usually it would end with the school year, and any assessments over the summer would not be reimbursed, but they're extending that due to just because a lot of those administration times were canceled, right, for kids, and so they're having to do those either online or just reschedule those for later on in the summer. And so TA has provided some flexibility there for y'all on that. And then the same would apply to the industry certification exams. And just remember that with those exams, the student has to pass them as well, right? So with a college prep, they just have to take them. but with the industry certification exam, they have to pass them as well. And then also, if there's any with switch to the online administration of the TSIA, I guess there's an extra fee associated with that, and so TA has said that that will also be included in the reimbursement sort of consideration. One sort of thing to consider, though, is that your participation rates could be lower than what TEA originally estimated, right? So that's what's sort of on the summary of finance right now. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're thinking about settle up and those kinds of things. That what's in there now was sort of TEA's estimate on if everything was normal, right? And so things are definitely not normal now, and so that could impact sort of the amount of those funds that you're able to keep. So just be mindful of that. And then we had some questions about the CCMR outcomes bonus, kind of what are the implications there? And of course, this is lagged, right? So the amount that's in your summary of finance right now on that line there is based on 17-18 graduates. The 19-20 graduates, so if you're expecting, decline in the number of those graduates that are deemed college career military ready under HB3, that wouldn't really show up until the 22-23 school year. And so just wanted to remind everyone that this particular funding item is lagged several years. And also, TA released a new list of fast growth districts that's up on the site. I believe there's only one or maybe two Region 1 districts in there. And so, but if you wanted to take a look at that, that is up there. The transportation allotment, we're getting a lot of questions about that, and we reached out to the folks at Leo Lopez and his team at TEA about kind of what their plans are on that, and they're just they're not ready to really come out with those yet. What we heard is those were initially going to be released in sort of that latest update to the school funding FAQ that came out a couple weeks back, but then it got pulled at the last minute, and so I haven't heard exactly what the problem was, what caused that, but just know that TA staff are working on putting those together, and according to them, that they should have something out within the next 2 or 3 weeks. With regards to spending requirements, and I think we've touched on this before, but the guidance from TEA is, and these are the state spending requirements, right? That the district should make a good faith effort to meet the various spending requirements. And unfortunately, the final decision over how those are enforced won't come until after you guys report your expenditure data. So just do the best that that we can there. In the guidance, though, TA does sort of point out that funding hasn't been interrupted, right? The FSP is still flowing, and so salaries for those program related personnel should continue to be paid, and that'll probably put y'all well on your way to meeting a lot of those spending requirements. They did also mention that districts will receive credit for spending if the expenditure is later reimbursed through either federal dollars or any other potential program, and so that doesn't sound like something that you will have to worry about. A question came in, do you think it's worth it to ask for a TA waiver on FIRST? I know they are considering that. They have, I believe, a whole separate FAQ on FIRST, and I can send that along. It doesn't have a whole lot in there, though. At least last time I checked, it was mostly just, we're sort of monitoring this, and we'll let y'all know. So if you wanted to reach out to them and sort of, outline some of your concerns, that's probably not a bad idea. If, if they hear that from, a lot of districts, that may sort of influence their thinking on that. And so it certainly wouldn't hurt to shoot them an email to that disasterinfo@, tea.texas.gov, I think is the email address. That's on the coronavirus website as well.
And for some of you who may be a little more shy, you can send me the information, and I'll put an email together and send it not only to the disaster email address, but I'll also send it to David Marks if it applies to the first. And if something applies to Leo Lopez, I'll just share with him also. These are just some of the items coming in from districts. I won't identify the district and so forth. But I know some of you go directly and have good contact with the TA folks and other folks, so that's perfectly great too. But like I say, if some of you would rather that I put something or just send something, let me know this coming week, and I can try and send something out by next Friday. Any comments?
Yeah, that'd be good. Sort of a good unified voice, I think would be important as well. Yeah. And then
Josh, just before you leave that, because
Mm-hmm.
I know that the thought crossed my mind on the state funding. At some point, and I realize that it's difficult for districts to spend the bulk of their cash in the fall, but ideally, when you really think about it, and we all run into this, right? All of us that have worked at ISDs, why is a principal still, or a federal program director or directors still trying to spend money for instructional programs in January, February, March, when in some cases the budget was available July 1, and in other cases the budget was available September 1? And I've said this before, and I'll keep saying it, I guess. It's if this money is supposed to be there for the instructional program, then it just seems kind of loosey goosey. I don't know what it just, how do you defend spending dollars in March, April? Because for the districts that do have PO deadlines, and I hope all districts do, you always run into, but I need one more month, or I need one more week, and this is conversations happening in, again, January, February, March. And it's kind of like, well, you must be thinking of the next fiscal year or the next school year, not this one, because you've already spent 4 or 6 months or more not getting these resources to the kids or in the teachers' hands. So, I don't know that we should be real surprised when the state gets after us to some degree, or the feds get after us to some degree, even in discussion on the training. And I'm sure lots of folks were on that one with Corey Green, because there were over 1,000 of us listening to him. I think that one was last week, not this week. When we've got 27 months, we've got 12 months for one thing to spend money, and then we get an extension, and so now we've got 27 months, 24 to 27, and now possibly in some of these programs even 36 months. I mean, that almost gives the impression that, what, I don't know that we were. And again, I'm not trying to hurt anybody's feelings. I've been out there. I thank God I've lived it. But we would sometimes get after our own staff about, well, how can you need it if you don't use it? It's, how do you exactly do that? Especially when you have some really high need campuses and so forth in different areas, and most of our campuses are high need campuses. But just for all of us, all you colleagues out there, keep working with your staff. Now, should we have enough fund balance? Should we have enough reserves? Do we need cash flow? Yes. But should we also be spending effectively, efficiently, properly, auditably, type of thing? Yes, we should be doing all of that. But it's hard to come back and really say, I need money, or I need budget. And then you go look at it and it's there. It's just been sitting there. Okay. Okay, Josh, I'll stop now. Now.
Well, thank you. No, that was good. That was helpful. Um, all right. So another item that was announced this week is that in PEAMS, you, they're going to ask, and I think this also a similar kind of thing was asked of districts that were impacted by Hurricane Harvey to sort of go in and report a crisis code in PEAMS. And so now, of course, this is a statewide disaster, so they're asking districts across the state to do this sort of exercise, and the sort of codes are laid out there. And really, it's just they're not going to be used for accountability. It's not going to impact state funding. This is, I guess, just to help TEA understand what's going on and to sort of help guide their planning. And so you can see there's a number of different codes there, and they break it up to whether or not there's sort of three main categories: engaged, what TA is calling non-contactable, which just rolls off the tongue, and then not engaged, right? So not contactable, I'm going to get that right, would just be a student that obviously you just can't even get on the phone or get, you can't engage with them at all. You don't even know where they are really. Not engaged, the way they're defining that is, you kind of know they've sort of responded initially, but they're just not engaged with the online instruction. But you kind of they're there, and you know that things are all right, but they're just not really doing. They're not really participating in the instructional side of things. And then, of course, engaged, as y'all would suspect, just means they're working with their teachers and doing their assignments, and you guys are kind of able to track them a little bit using through your distance learning programs. And so there's the various combinations of that come out to different codes and PEAMS, and so that's just an item that your PEAMS coordinators will need to be mindful of moving forward.
And on that one, again,
Mm-hmm.
before we leave, just came out as far as I understand. But so each child will have two different codes, right? One prior to April 30th, and they're getting the information from the teachers, because who else would know?
I believe that it's a child gets one code, right? So if there are various combinations, right? So if they're engaged through April 30th and engaged through May 1st through the end of the school year, there'll be a 7A. If they're not contactable, both of those periods, there'll be a 7B. Yeah, that's my understanding. There's this link here is a guidance document that kind of goes through this in a little bit more detail if you guys are interested, or you want to pass this along to your PEAM staff. And
again, I'm thinking the ones who are doing or telling the PEAMS folks or their principals are the teachers, right? They're the only ones who would know.
Yeah, I would think so, or someone else that is checking if there's instructional coordinators or some other sort of support staff that could check if students are monitor their time on whatever platform you guys are using. But yeah, it's so I mean the way it's defined here was responding to requests from administrators and teachers and completing assignments. So yeah, you guys would rely heavily on teachers, I'd imagine, to sort of check that box.
And right along with Happy Teacher Appreciation Day or week.
Yeah. Yes. And so then just a quick federal funding update. So we've had four sort of phases of stimulus so far, right? The CARES Act was really the third of the fourth. The fourth one, despite a lot of advocacy at the federal level, did not include any sort of ARA type supports.
Josh, I'm just gonna stop you, and I hate to interrupt you, but
I'm
gonna go back just real quick to the chat. So only one code, yes, and yes, teachers, and I got a reply from our PEAMS person here, Diana Perez, and then from one of the CFOs. Do you think that this data will be used as an attendance issue that might impact our ADA? What are they, what are they going to eventually do with the data?
Well, so I mean, this is covering this school year, right? At least this reporting, this is for your summer PEAM submission. At least that's how it's being described now. It could be in future PEAM submissions, but at least initially it's for the summer one. So that would just impact your 1920 funding. And then we already kind of know uh, the ADA adjustments that TEA is going to make, right, for 1920. We've kind of talked about that last time, looking at the historical ratio and bringing that down and everything. And so that would, if they were going to include this information in terms of the ADA calculation, that would be a departure from the methodology they've been laying out over the past several weeks now. And so it's not impossible, I guess, that they could do that, but I would think unlikely, given that they've sort of spent a lot of time explaining this to everybody. But things change quickly nowadays, and so it's just something to keep our eye on moving forward. And then I guess just make sure everyone is looking at the chat. Looks like Region 1 is also having a workshop sort of on this issue, so you may want to share that with staff that would be interested. Okay. So like I was saying, with regards to the federal stimulus picture, that fourth package that was passed in late April didn't include any additional dollars to shore up state budgets, or that were sort of earmarked for education. However, once that fourth package was passed, it immediately kicked off negotiations and discussions on a fifth stimulus package that would sort of resemble in terms of both the type of funding and the scale of the funding, what we saw with the ARA funding last time in the last recession. And so the way that the sort of debate is shaping up now, it really seems like the Democrats are pushing for kind of a $1 to really $2 trillion bill that would include money to help state budgets to really fill in any gaps over the next few years. But the sort of counter on the other side is that they're pushing for liability protections for businesses that open during this time, right? So if you open up, right, everyone wants the economy to get going again, but a lot of businesses are worried that if they do open up and someone gets sick or contracts COVID-19, right, on their facility, that could open up, potential legal problems, and so that's a concern that seems to be the sort of how the negotiation is playing out in DC right now. Kind of, if I could summarize both sides very quickly, that seems to be kind of where things are at the moment. It does seem like they're getting closer to an actual proposal, and so we could see sort of maybe like a House and Senate version of the bill next week or in the coming weeks. But it does seem like they're getting closer to getting words on a page and feeling comfortable enough with that to get it out for a vote in the respective bodies. So there could be some news on that in the coming weeks. And then, of course, I think we touched on this last time, but just to reiterate, I did see new guidance from TEA that with regards to the CARES Act, right, that third stimulus package that we've talked about before, that they are hoping to get a TAA letter out by the end of the month on that, with some sort of specific information about how the distribution on that could work. Connie, did you have something to add?
Well, when on that second bullet, when you mentioned Republicans are pushing for liability protections for businesses that open, what about schools?
That's I was looking for that in the article. I haven't seen that. I have not seen that being discussed. I would hope that our leaders would recognize the need for that. But I think at least the way it was sort of framed in sort of the public comments, at least, is they're very interested in getting the economy up and running, and so that could be a way to facilitate that. And so I do totally agree with your point, however, that those same kind of concerns, right, school districts would need to be aware of as well.
Well, yesterday, one of the superintendents on that discussion mentioned, parents will forgive you for a lot of things. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
they're pretty forgiving, but if children end up pretty ill or heaven forbid, we lose children in this process, that'll be a different story. They
Right.
can forgive whatever. There are different ways that unfortunately children are harmed while at our sites, but when it comes to their physical beings and so forth, and that would be a whole other. But that just reminded me. I thought, well, if we're concerned about the businesses, then what about our districts and our
Right.
charters and so
Yeah.
forth?
And again, I'm just sort of passing along the way it's been discussed so far. I would really hope that those considerations are being made by our leadership as well. And that's sort of also just another thing to remember as you're putting your forecast together for next school year. That just kind of consider, we, as Connie mentioned, you can. There may be some parents out there that are worried about sending their kids into, for in-person instruction. And so that could impact, of course, ADA, which then, of course, has implications on your funding level. And so, I would encourage all the districts here to try and think about that a little bit. Make sure you're talking to your communities and seeing kind of what their expectations are and kind of their comfort level, and seeing what and trying to think think about what sort of impact that could have on ADA levels next school year. And then just real quickly, you can file this under don't let what is the phrase? Don't let a good crisis go to waste, I guess. So part of the CARES Act is gives the U.S. Department of Education a little bit of discretion over how funds are distributed. Right, that sort of major block of funding is sort of driven by formulas. There's another smaller portion that the Department of Education has more discretion over. And last week, Secretary DeVos announced sort of a mini race to the top kind of grant opportunity for states. And some critics are sort of pointing out one element of that's sort of to use the branding from the Department of Education. It's micro grants to families looking to access high quality remote learning opportunities. I should say this is not, I think it's around $200 million, which, across the federal, across the entire country would not significantly, would not result in a huge impact, but it's just something to kind of keep in mind in terms of what our Department of Education is focused on at the moment. And I guess the thing that critics are worried about is that these sort of micro grants sort of look and feel and smell kind of like vouchers, and so that's just something that we'll keep our eye on. And again, this is not a huge pot of money, and I don't expect this to have drastic impacts. But again, just want to update y'all on kind of what the conversation is looking like at the federal level.